for the very generous introduction. He has been a good friend and a great teacher to me about Tibet, the Tibetan culture, the struggle of the Tibetan people. And I have talked to him on numerous occasions here at UMass and at one of my favorite restaurants in the whole world, Losar Cafe in Northampton. And so I'm sure a lot of you are well aware of that wonderful, wonderful restaurant. I also want to thank Kelson Nangpa and the Students for a Free Tibet for organizing this and for all of your activism. You know, in my office in Washington, D.C., I have a poster. That says, it's prominently featured, it says Students for a Free Tibet. And when I was in China about a year and a half ago, more than one Chinese government official who had never visited my office but made mention of the fact that I have a Students for a Free Tibet poster in my office. So I want to thank you for that. And you know, I am really proud to represent so many members of the Tibetan community as part of my constituency. I appreciate very much your friendship, and I value your advice. You know, one of the things that has happened in Washington over the last many years is that politicians routinely will say nice things about His Holiness the Dalai Lama, will repeatedly tell the Tibetan community how much we value your culture and your religion and all that you stand for. But then that's about it. We say we want to support Tibetan rights in Tibet and all around the world, but quite frankly, we have seen a crackdown on Tibetans and on human rights issues, and it's really disturbing. It's getting worse. The Chinese government is getting more oppressive, and that should be of concern to all of us. A year and a half ago, as Donna mentioned, I went to China and we went to visit Tibet. It was difficult to get the Chinese government to let us into Tibet. I think after I introduced the reciprocity bill, which basically says that if you deny American diplomats and journalists and citizens access to Tibet, then the United States reserves the right to deny your diplomats and your journalists access to certain places in the United States. After the introduction of that bill, I think they decided to rethink allowing us to visit Tibet, and we did. And one of the things I want you to know is that everywhere I went throughout China, but especially in Tibet, I talked about the Tibetans who live in Massachusetts, who are part of this community. And because people would ask me, why do you care about Tibet? Well, we should care about any place in the world where people's rights are being denied, but we have an active community here in Massachusetts that we value. And so I said that I'm your voice to voice the concerns that I've heard over and over and over again from so many of you. And everywhere we went in China and everywhere in Tibet, we began every meeting by saying we have high regard and affection for His Holiness the Dalai Lama, and that we believe that he ought to be able to have the right to go back to Tibet, to be able to visit his homeland, to be able to visit his people. And we believe that the people in Tibet ought to have the right to practice their religion the way they want to. They ought to be able to read what they want to. They ought to be able to speak the Tibetan language without any fear or any repercussions by the Chinese government. And we also said that we believe that there ought to be a U.S. consulate open up in Lhasa to help facilitate travel back and forth, and that we believe that the dialogue between His Holiness and the Tibetan community and China ought to begin again, that there ought to be these discussions over the issues of autonomy and how to respect the rights of the Tibetan people. And so that was the message. And I was hoping, quite frankly, that we would see more progress. We had a number of meetings with the Chinese officials. We came back, but quite frankly, it seems that things have gotten more difficult. And so, in May, Leader Pelosi, myself, and a high-level delegation of members of Congress from the United States, as well as leading diplomats and parliamentarians from governments all around the world are going to travel to visit His Holiness the Dalai Lama in India. And we're going to formalize this kind of arrangement so the Chinese government knows that the concern about Tibet is not going away, and it's an international concern. And the voices of concern are going to get louder and louder and louder, because we value the Tibetan culture, and we value and we celebrate all that His Holiness the Dalai Lama stands for: love and peace and nonviolence. If only the world would pay more attention, if only the world would heed his advice, what a better world this would be. And so we're not going away, and we're going to continue in a respectful, but, and this sounds very un-Dalai Lama-like, but aggressive manner to make sure that this message is heard loud and clear. You know, the United States and China have a lot in common, but we ought to use some of the leverage we have to insist that their policy toward Tibet changes. There ought to be a consequence. There ought to be a consequence to the repression that continues to go on each and every day. You know, the burning of religious sites and the destruction of temples. It is unconscionable. And the whole world needs to do more than just say it's unfortunate. There needs to be a consequence. I also passed a bill called the Global Magnitsky Bill, it's called. It's named after a Russian man who exposed corruption in Russia, and his reward was that he was tortured and killed by the Russian government. But this legislation says that the United States should hold responsible human rights violators around the world who commit terrible crimes against civilian people. And so in Russia, we have basically said to certain people, you know, you can't hide your money in US banks. You can't travel here with your family to Disney World. You can't enjoy the right to come to this country because of your terrible record on human rights. So there's a consequence. Even if it's not a consequence in Russia, there is a consequence here. And we're hoping other countries will adopt similar legislation. With regard to Tibet, one of the things I'm going to recommend after our visit is if things do not change within the Chinese government toward Tibet, then we ought to use the Global Magnitsky Act to identify those Chinese officials who are responsible for developing and implementing their Tibet policy and impose that sanction on them as well. Again, there has to be a consequence, because I think if there's not a consequence, things won't change. Finally, I just want to say, you know, there is this view amongst some of the Chinese government that all they have to do is wait. That His Holiness is 80 or 81 now, and I think they feel he can't hang on forever. But I believe that he will hang on for a lot longer, so I think they're going to have to deal with him for quite a bit in the future. But I think it's important, especially now, when we have His Holiness alive and vibrant and so vital, that we make it clear that his spirit lives on forever, that the interest of people in the United States Congress is not going to go away when the Dalai Lama is no longer with us. This is a human rights struggle. This is about making sure that the people of Tibet are treated with dignity and respect that every human being on this planet deserves. So I look forward to working with all of you on that. And I know I said it finally, but one finally. ThoughTup has been working very closely with the Tibetan officials, trying to secure a date for His Holiness to come and visit here at University of Massachusetts campus. And we had a meeting with some high-ranking Tibetan officials in Washington just a couple of days ago. And ThoughTup, every time I see him, tells me, you got to reinforce the message, and we did. But even before I reinforced the message, I think they anticipated what I was going to say, because they said, that His Holiness is going to visit the United States a couple of times this year, and probably the second time will be in the fall. And the hope is to then schedule a formal visit on this campus with His Holiness then, and I think it would be an incredible moment for all of us and for this entire community. And I'm especially proud to be here with my friend Mayor David Narkowitz, who sort of introduced the Mayor of Northampton, who is, I think, one of the most incredible mayors in the country. He's here today, even though Amherst is not Northampton. He's here today because of his respect for this community. And he also happens to be a graduate of UMass. So that's another thing that's going for him that makes him so incredible. So I appreciate you being here, but I will just tell you that on the issue of human rights, on the issue of respecting the rights of the Tibetan people to practice their religion, and to get this dialogue going again between China and His Holiness, and to hopefully get His Holiness an opportunity to go back and visit his people. You know, when we were in Tibet, we went to some of these isolated temples. The Chinese government didn't want us to go there. Our response was, they had other things scheduled, and our view was, well, we're going to go, and if you don't want to, help it, facilitate it, we'll take a taxi and go on our own. So we went to these temples, and the thing that amazed me, you go down, all these Tibetan monks praying and and learning about this incredible religion, but we were alone with them. People we would say that we bring the regards of His Holiness the Dalai Lama, and people were so excited. They were so happy. And everywhere we go, people would ask how he's doing, and for us to pass on to him how much he means to them. Even though in Tibet today, if somebody has a book written by His Holiness, it is a crime. So as hard as the Chinese government has tried to stamp out his influence, and as hard as they have tried to eviscerate this incredibly beautiful religion and faith, they have failed. They have failed. But we have a lot of work to do this year, and I look forward to working with all of you in this room as we promote this cause, and I am confident. I'm confident that we can make progress. I really am. I think there's an opportunity here to make progress, and I thank you very much for welcoming me here today.